So starting to get into content creation has got me thinking. I had two things I want to talk about today. The first, practically everything you could do content-wise has already been done before in 5 different ways. Practically everything you're going to be doing in life is going to have been done by so many different times at this point. And it has me wondering, is anything unique? Is there anything we can really do differently content-wise? And I feel like the large majority of the time, their answer is no. So what makes something unique then? The perspective and spin we personally put up upon it, the perspective we give, and how that influences how the words come out. I feel like a lot of these sorts of conversations tend to be very scripted, and I feel like that makes them so much less real and genuine. It kind of takes away from the meaning of them, I feel like. I mean, I can understand why it's a lot to think about, it's a lot to talk about, but I think there's only one real way to do it. So anyways, every strength we have as a person is something that's going to be able to be used to define our content in a positive way and change the sort of content we can provide. Every flaw we have gives our content personality and character. Let's say your voice. If you have a very high-pitched voice or you're able to just modify it to be very excitable, you're going to be able to just generate a lot of interest off of that and that alone, and you're going to end up being a lot more able to do things that would be typically excitable for younger audiences, for instance. If you have a more monotone voice, you'd probably be suited more towards something like countdowns, for instance. The Burger King foot lettuce guy comes to mind for that. And I don't think something being done before is really a reason not to try and do it. That just leads you to end up doing nothing because you think about something and you see how this other person has already done it, right? So you just end up psyching yourself out of doing anything, and that just doesn't give you anywhere. If you put the effort in and you put your perspective on it, maybe something changes or somebody finds it interesting and you start getting your own audience and following, and you just keep finding new things to talk about with your own perspective on it. I don't think it's what we talk about as much as what we bring to the table on that topic and how we talk about the topic that makes our content interesting and then gives content purpose online. Going along with that, I wanted to talk about another thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently and that I feel like define is going to define a lot of my content and really defines me as a person, and that would be autism. Now, I have high functioning autism, and that's been something that has defined a lot of my life recently. I feel like a lot of the time when you're told you have something like autism, you end up responding in one of a few ways. I feel like the first way to view it is to just get told about it, and just feel so dejected over it. And I feel like that's how it typically affects me. You realize that if I don't tell people, there's always going to be so many misunderstandings. There's just always going to be such a big communicative gap due to just like how you talk. Like, for instance, if I talk through text at all, I kind of externalize my thought process and my emotions, and that ends up causing things to come out as just these massive walls of text. And a lot of the time, people just can't handle the intensity of that, or the amount of focus you place on the conversation, or you end up feeling anxious because other people can't match that sort of pacing, and they themselves get uncomfortable. You project that onto them with how you yourself feel about it. And I don't think that's healthy, but at the same time, the other ship I've been running into is if I try and not think about that, I feel like I'm just denying a core part of my identity, right? I feel like I'm lying to myself if I'm not being upfront about it. And I guess that's just a large part of that is due to how ex- others have reacted to like myself in the past with and without the context of being told they have autism. And of course, it never is an excuse for things. It only explains things, but it does explain a lot of behavioral patterns. Anyways, I feel like the second usual way people respond to it is just by trying to ignore it, and I don't think you can really ignore it, and I don't think that can really get you anywhere. I feel like that just ends up resulting in you doing all these things that hurt you or hurt others without realizing why, right? You just think to yourself, oh, it's not affecting me in this way, right? Oh, it's not having that much impact on things, and because of how you just try and reject the impact it has, you end up not really changing, right? You just end up stagnating for a while, and you end up running into a big trap. And neither of those two ways is all that healthy, of course, but I feel like, well, it's usually asking a lot for people to be upfront and honest about it because it's like people are gonna mistreat you and treat you differently for it, even if they intend well. It just changes things. It changes how people interact with you and what people think of you, whether they say it or not. And that kind of sucks, but nothing you can do or say will really change that. And I feel like it's usually better to just say that you have it, be upfront about it, be honest about it, and let other people react how they want to because if as long as you're honest about it and the impact it has, I feel like it's almost entirely on the other person to just respond accordingly to that. If they're going to mistreat you over that, then I think it's for the better that that friendship ends right then and there, that connection. Things aren't gonna be healthy for you, and it's just gonna be a toxic relationship, and there isn't much point to having that around. At the same time, though, I do understand how it's very difficult to come to terms with autism and how it affects you usually, and you might not even understand how it affects you. I don't even. I just understand that kind of like affects how I process things for the most part, and it makes it very difficult to just talk about emotional things. The biggest issue I end up having is that I feel like I never belong socially, and I feel like just due to that core gap in communication, the distance that autism gives you over other people socially, I just don't think that's ever going to change. And I guess that's just a fact of the matter. I guess that's just how things are. And I guess I just have to live with that and come to expect with that and just try my best to not be bothered by that. I don't think trying to like make myself unaware of the matter helps things. I think being ignorant of it just makes things so much worse for you down the line. But you also can't let it just define you. You can't let that entire struggle defeat you, or else things are equally just not going to change. And I think in general, autism can make it very difficult to change out of those sort of habits that develop. I think the most you can do is just try your best to just be yourself, whatever version of yourself that is, with and without autism. It's hard to determine exactly how autism affects you, how it defines you, or what's you and what's just a product of autism and how it's affected and shaped your development. And it's kind of maddening to think about. So I think the only thing you can really think is that it's you either way. It's you now. And all you can do is just try your best to change from that and understand that it might take a while to change, that you won't necessarily just be able to change it for yourself. And you can try and surround yourself with other people who like treat you decently, who will support you in your development rather than just trying to hold the fact that you have autism against you. Especially online with COVID and quarantine and all that, it's just so difficult to consistently be around others. You feel like you never belong around them, and it's just so hard to feel comfortable around others, socially speaking. And that might not ever change. You might always just feel the same way. But it's like, again, you can't really dwell on that fact. You just have to focus on the positive aspects of whatever sort of disorder you have, in this case, autism. And you just have to try and coexist with it, I guess. It's just a part of you, right? You don't get to choose it. You can't change it. It just is, whether you want it to be or not. But you can try and change how you let that show, right? How you let that define yourself. You have a say in that. Even if you don't always have a say in how others are going to react, which most of the time you don't. All you can do is try and put yourself in the position where things will end up naturally aligning the best, I think. And just keep trying to shift things around to just maintain a positive mental focus, because once you get held down into the negatives, once you start focusing on the negatives, you're just going to keep sinking and sinking, especially when you have any sort of like mental disorder in play that can impair your ability to be impartial and your judgment in general on mental things. A lot of the time, I feel like I understand a part of myself. I feel like I understand something, but then it's also just completely possible that that's just a lot, the lies that I sell myself on. That it's just the rationalizations I make to try and explain things, and it's actually not that much of an understanding of how things are. But trying to grip that, trying to understand that and make that nuance when you yourself are involved with all that bias and all these factors clouding your judgment, it's just not something you can do. So I think the most you can do is just to try and understand it the best you can, or the best you think you can. Shift that perspective when it seems inaccurate and when it's challenged and proven to be untrue. But then besides that, to just, again, exist with it and let it be. You gotta choose to just try and be the best version of yourself you can be, regardless of what sort of affliction you have. And if things don't work out in the short term, that's okay. You can always focus on the long term and how you want things to be, not how things are or how you think things will be. You just have to focus on the future you want to see for yourself and try and align things to be that way. I feel like a lot of the time these things aren't things you can just like change or do right, but you can try and guide yourself and guide others with disorders to like put themselves into spots where they're gonna develop more healthily. And I think at the end of the day, that's all you really can do. You just have to be yourself and accept it as something that is, but not something that will be always. I hope some of this is coherent, and maybe this perspective just helps you get a bit of a grip for what things are like for some people with disorders, or at least for the sorts of like thought processes that go into it, in my case, if nothing else. And maybe that bit of perspective will help you with your own sorts of disorders. I think there's a certain degree of maturity and understanding that you're never going to be able to fully understand others, that they're never going to be able to fully understand you, and you just have to try and meet everybody halfway. You just have to try and accept what you understand at the moment and hope that others can understand why you act the ways you do. You just have to try, I guess, yeah. There's nothing you can really do besides that. You just have to exist. I think even if you can't fully understand others, if you don't always understand why they act the ways they do, that you can try and understand them in a way that you're capable of rationalizing and processing. And I think the key to being able to do that is just to focus on behavioral patterns, to just see how people react to what. If you're not that familiar or capable with processing things emotionally in the moment, to just try and put it under a logical framework of cause effect, if more than anything else, and just hope that's good enough. And if it's not, then just try and be direct and upfront with others and try and resolve that communicative difference. And I guess that's the big idea here. You just have to be upfront about these things. You have to talk to others to be able to resolve these issues, or else they're just going to keep ballooning because all these things end up being so based in assumptions due to one person having this sort of disorder, one person not, everybody just having their own conflicting perspectives and disorders. And you just have to try and bridge that communication gap and hope others will as well, right? There's nothing else you can really do. You just have to try. And if others don't, then all you can really do is just move on socially and find others that will meet you halfway there and try and bridge that communication gap. I think it's something you end up experiencing a lot in general, but especially when disorders are involved, like autism, for instance. Just due to how inherently differently you're going to be functioning in a way, you know? And of course, it affects everybody differently, but it's just so core to at least my perspective, and I feel like that of probably others with the disorder. And I don't think you can be blamed for the differences there, for having those differences, but you're obligated to just try to understand others, and for others to try and understand you. And the only way to do that is if you don't understand something, you just have to talk to somebody about it, and you have to try and explain and rationalize and show them why you think the way you do or why you act the way you do to help others understand. And if they can't accept that, then that's not your fault, as long as you're trying, you know? As long as you're trying to put yourself in a position where you're going to grow and not stagnate and end up doing those same sorts of behaviors all the time. And I think that's all you can really be asked of. You're not always going to have that great of an awareness. You might not always have that much self-awareness. And you just have to go off of what sorts of bits of awareness you can generate and cling to provide some sense of stability in life. I think a lot of the time, these communicative differences end up not really being the fault of either person. I think it's usually just that one person typically doesn't know how to react or just genuinely doesn't understand the other person's sort of thought processes and perspectives. And I feel like too much of the time that just ends up not being resolved because we just stick to our assumptions, right? We just think that we know what's best. We think we understand that we're hurting this person and why. That maybe it's just best to sever the friendship and just not risk hurting them anymore. And in doing so, we end up hurting them way more than we ever thought we would be otherwise. And that just comes down to us thinking we know what's best and not actually working with the other person. If you want to understand something, you have to work with the other person to understand it, is the underlying idea here. And once you do that, I think the presence of any sort of disorder, or at least autism, is going to be something that bothers you a lot less, and it's going to be something that you can come to terms with because you've kind of found a way to defeat it. Even if others don't always respond to it well or understand it themselves, at least you can understand it, and at least you can understand why, and why they might react the way they do. And you know, some of the time maybe it's just not healthy for the other person to be around you due to the way you are. And them just understanding that early on can prevent so much of that sort of trouble and pain to both parties from the onset of things, which I think just is even more of a reason to be upfront about these things, right? And yeah, that's my advice. Just no matter how isolated or disconnected or emotional you feel over something, to just go to the other person and to just tell them tell them why you think something is, tell why you feel like you've done you've done this or hurt them, or why they've hurt you, and what you think they need to do to try and help you get past that sort of difference. And if they don't, oh well. But all the time you have so much to gain and so little to lose. Nobody really benefits from just it being an awkward status quo of a friendship, you know? You just have to keep trying to put that effort in, even if it hurts you, because it's gonna hurt you either way. But at least you get an element of control over it, and you can turn it into something that doesn't hurt you, into a healthier connection, as long as you just try and hope the other person does as well, right? And yeah, that's all that can really be asked of you. You just have to try and understand and be understood. And again, the only way to do that is to just talk to people about it, to explain things to them. And sometimes people don't want to accept those answers, or again, they're just not comfortable with interacting with you, and that's fine. But you just save yourself and everybody else so much trouble by just being upfront about it, you know? Living your life in fear of just everything changing, everything being different, by you just being upfront about things and being honest isn't any way to live. Everything you can do is just going to be interpreted by other people however they want to interpret it, right? Everybody's always going to take away whatever they want to with their own perspectives, and all you can do is just try and infuse your own perspective into that and show them the way you understand things, and maybe show them why that could be a way for them to understand things as well, or for them to just understand and respect your understanding of things. And I think that's how you genuinely bridge a lot of those communication gaps. I'll say it again, I really don't think just keeping your troubles to yourself or your disorder is going to fix anything for you. I think it's just going to end up being this huge burden that you feel so guilty about that you feel like you're hurting everybody with, and I'm speaking from personal experience here. And to defeat that, yeah, you just have to tell people about it. It might make some people uncomfortable, but it's going to save them and yourself from so much uncomfortability and pain in the long term by just that simple act. And you know, there's always so many reasons not to do something. And I think it's much more important to focus on the few reasons why to do something, on the few reasons of actually being able to change something, of what might change for the better, because things are always going to change for the worse unless you put your foot down and you start to make them change for the better, right? The more time that you leave social things unresolved, the less control you're going to have of them, and the more they're going to fester in a negative way anyways. So you might as well just confront them and see what happens. And that's all I have to really offer on the matter for now, yeah. Or at least this specific tangent. And I think, well, I'm going to go back on that statement for a second. I think that showing others your own perspective and your own troubles helps them relate to it and understand their own troubles a lot more, which is just, again, even more of a reason to do it, right? It's even more of a motivation to just be upfront about these things, because you might not just be helping yourself or saving others from trouble. You might be genuinely helping others and helping them grow out of their disorders and bad habits. And I think that's something that can't be understated with the importance of it. A lot of the time in the past, I would just see how some of the ways I acted harmed others, and I would just have this constant battle of self-identity of trying to figure out how much of it was caused by autism, how much of it was just me, myself, and the answer I reached is that regardless of autism or not, I'm the one who's actively determining how it's showing by not being honest with myself about how it is affecting me in the moment, regardless of autism or not, right? Of how it exists, whether I want it to or not. whether I have autism or not. It's hurting others because I'm letting it hurt others is was the simple answer. And in that sort of process, like, and on the way to like understanding that, a lot of the time I would just run away from my issues. I would run away from others who I felt like I'd hurt. And again, that ended up hurting them so much more than just talking things out and trying to understand and be understood. I just wasn't honest about the disorder. I wasn't honest about how it affected me. And it just didn't do me any favors, and it didn't do anybody else any favors. It just, even though I thought I was aware at the time, I was so unaware of the issue. And I only gained that awareness from just taking a step back and realizing that talking about it is the only way to solve it, you know? As much as I would love to just forget about the disorder and how much it does define me and how much it might define others with it, I just don't get a choice in it being a thing, right? So why should I try and ignore it? Why should I always just run away and try and act all noble-like while I'm not actually resolving the underlying issues there? And it felt really good to do in the moment, and then I'd always have such feelings of guilt afterwards. And it feels so good to just understand why that was. It feels so good to just know how to process things in a healthier way, and how to just exist without having a fight with myself always over every little thing. Of having to fight tooth and nail just to find reasons to want to live. But I'm going to shift back to a more positive topic here. I think in general, a healthier way to just exist with these disorders is to focus on the positive ways it affects you, not the negative ways, to just embrace it and embrace the good it brings as well. Embrace the perspective it gives you and just be upfront about these things. Make content related to it and just try and help others with what you know, right? And I guess that's why I'm making this video here, right? The negatives are always going to exist, whether you accept them as things that exist or not. But the positives, they only exist if you let yourself view them in that way. If you say to yourself, okay, I have this disorder, I don't get a say in it, but at the same time, I can help others come to terms with their own disorders. I can let myself just exist. There's no shame in just existing and being. You know, I have my own perspective. The disorder actually helps a lot with that. It gives me a really good ability to be introspective and I think at least aware of things and reflective. And it gives me a lot of interest in trying to find out how disorders affect other people and helping them get past that. And in trying to figure out how people work in general, especially among communities. And I can't ignore the sorts of help the disorders give me in that regard. It's something I've had to work around and have for my entire life. And having to work around that has just helped me grow so much as a person. And I'm really excited to see how that ends up shaping in the future once I get into more hardline psychological based classes and courses. And I do think, just due to it being something you don't have a choice in, finding those few positive things, the few positive ways, whatever disorder you have, I'd say especially autism though, just affects you as a person because it does have a lot of positive impact as well. It gives you such unique perspective and the hyper focus. That's why I was trying to think of. That's what I was trying to reach to. The sort of hyper focus it gives you, in this case for me, on analysis and introspection and just figuring things out socially has just allowed me to have such passion for all these topics and subjects and to look at them in such detail, like all these differences across different regions and gameplay and just how personality shapes you within communities. it's just given me such good tools to work with, such sharpened and refined tools, right? And if I just spent all my time focusing on how autism affects me negatively, I don't think I would have realized that of how the hyperfocus is actually so helpful at times. And of course, it has negative effects as well, but that's not really something you can control that much. But you can control how it shows positively, right? That's the point I'm reaching at here. You can decide, okay, this exists whether I want it to or not. This affects me and others negatively from time to time, and I can try and mitigate that. And while I try and mitigate that, I can also try and actually have benefit from it by directing all this analytical energy, all this focus, all these mixed feelings towards trying to do something with it, right? And yeah, this has been a very personal video, and I hope you find it helpful and insightful to some extent. Uh, yeah, just find out what drives you, what sort of things you would be able to direct all that energy and care to, all these. I think a big thing with autism is that ends up making it a lot harder to be aware of how you feel emotionally, right? But I feel like it ends up making a lot of those emotions when you are like consciously aware of them, when you do know of them, so much more deeply rooted, right? Like you're able to feel and understand these emotions so deeply once you get to the point of having awareness of them, and I think that's something really good. I think it's something so unique and interesting to just think about and focus on because it's like you have to go through such growth to be able to even get to that point of understanding it. But then it's just like, oh wow, I'm an actual human being. I'm able to understand and feel these things, even if I have a lot more room to work from than others. Once you get to that point, it just feels all that more rewarding and healthy and good, you know? My point is, right, I've said this a few times before, is to just do something good with things, even if because that's what you do get a choice, and you don't get a choice in how things affect you negatively a lot of the time. At least when it's like more deeply rooted and integral to you, you don't get a choice in its existence, but you do get a choice in just how it shows positively, right? Of just being able to make something significant from it. And yeah, that's it. Have a good one. So I actually forgot to record this bit that I was going to talk about, but I wanted to go back and clarify a little bit. So the word I was grasping for a while there was hyperfocus. And that's the positive thing that you can derive from a disorder like autism. There's so many ways it negatively impacts you, and that's going to define your life. But the hyperfocus, that sheer sense of commitment and obligation to those singular things above all else that you're passionate about, that can allow you to do so much, especially in the field of content creation. It provides you such strong motivation until you just feel like you've done something satisfactorily. And I think that's very much something that like it can do harm, but if you focus on what you can do with it, if you try and control that and use that in a way that allows you to just focus on something that you really care about and that you want to spend a lot of time into, I feel like it ends up being very useful and valuable. And I feel like that sort of drive is hard to meet otherwise. And I think that's the big idea here. Regardless of how it defines you otherwise, it's really hard to overlook that whole part of it. For me, it's done a lot of good for teams I've been on, for instance. And then also when it comes to documents that I care about, it's just allowed me to work on them so much and get so much done in such short times. And that gets very draining, but it also just isn't something that I entirely have control over in the first place, or at least not to my understanding. So it's like I might as well get something out of the experience, get something out of all of that emotion. And yeah, I don't think I really have that much else to say. Initially, it's gonna be a lot more verbose in this little follow-up bit, but I honestly kind of forgot most of what I had to say, so I hope this is good enough. And yeah, just find out what you're passionate about, and I guess use that sort of drive to just achieve your goals there, yeah, because it's going to allow you to do such good things. It's going to allow you to really just view your disorder, whatever, like whatever it be. Although in this case, of course, I'm referring to autism in just like such a healthier way because you're going to be seeing genuine results from it, like things that help other people and help yourself and lead to just such care filled works. I feel like in this case and within most of my interactions within the community and doing community groups for Team Fortress 2, that sort of hyper focus is what's guided me along most of the way. And I don't think I would have nearly as much perspective if I didn't have that sort of ability to just tunnel vision and hyperanalyze specific things. So, my point is, no matter how something negatively affects you, it's always going to allow you to do something better as a result of it. Everything in life ends up being a trade off, whether you want to accept it or not. So if it's something you don't get a choice in, you might as well use it for what it's worth. And another, I'm not sure I'd call it nice part of having autism, but another way it affects me a lot of the time, and I think other people, is that it just allows me to entirely shift emotions to the side for a bit because it's like I won't be consciously aware of them, but eventually it does take the form of just overwhelming anxiety when I do get aware of it. But in the meantime, I'm just able to push myself to such limits and get so much done in that time frame, and that's something that I'm really proud of a lot of the time. And yeah, I hope you have a good day. Well, actually, before I end it off, yeah, it's just like it's so easy to try and think on how these sorts of differences and uniquenesses can be detrimental to yourself, right? Because I mean, they certainly are. Having them follow you around everywhere gets really, really depressing. But focusing on how that depresses you just doesn't do you any good. It doesn't change things. It doesn't fix anything, right? It just ends up entrenching your behavior to be further down the lines of like whatever sorts of patterns it's already down because you just accept it as some truth to yourself. And I feel like that ends up being the biggest issue a lot of the time for people with disorders. It's just like others tell them how they are. They end up putting themselves down so much because they only really end up looking at the negative side of the equation and just holding it against themselves and unfairly putting them on trial for everything that they might not even have control over. Because it's like when everybody wants to point out the flaws and differences you have and hold that against you, it becomes really easy to just play into that yourself and end up genuinely embodying some of those traits and just not growing out of them. So just being able to take a step back and realize, hey, some of this is something that I do have control over, at least in regards to how it ends up showing, how it ends up coming through. That just, it makes things feel so much nicer mentally, even if just for a bit of time before things end up going back to just feeling dejected. And so I guess that's just what I'd recommend. Yeah, just stop trying to look for the negatives, right? Because you already kind of know all the negatives. Just try and figure out what the benefits are. Because it's like others aren't going to be doing that for you. Others are going to be looking at the negatives for you. And you're going to accept those negatives if those negatives are what you look for. things are going to seem darker if you're looking into the darkness, so to speak. And yeah. So, what I mean by that is that a lot of the time, people end up looking at these sorts of differences, right? Like, oh, you have autism, and they just, not always intentionally, but they just end up viewing that as a reason to just stick away from this person or treat them differently, right? Like, we just look for differences, and with those differences, we look for reasons to treat people differently because that's just how humans work, I guess. And there's it just doesn't help if you feed into that. You can't accept those things as things that define you. You have to be able to just advocate for yourself and tell yourself that that's not all me, you know. I still have control over some of these things. I'm a human being too. I have emotions. I can experience all these things even if it takes you a bit longer to process them, you know. It's just a difference, but it's a difference that you need to understand the positive significance of rather than just revel in how it defines you negatively or trying to avoid the impact it has. Because if you try and avoid how it affects you, then you're going to end up running into as many issues as if you just hold it all against yourself. Because again, you know, you're lying to yourself, and that's just not healthy. It's gonna hurt your growth so much in the long term, and I've seen that happen a lot with other people with similar disorders. It's just all you really can do, I think, at the end of the day. When others don't advocate for you, all you can do is advocate for yourself. And you know, some people like to give credit. They try and they try and welcome you, right? Like they try and be accepting and understandable, but they just don't always have that great of an understanding for themselves, and sometimes they just make things worse, or you just don't feel comfortable around them, and you just feel the need to distance from them, even though they're trying to help you, and that kind of sucks to experience. But it's always nice to try and see people who comfort you, yeah. It's just that the majority of the time, these things end up being held against you rather than used to define you positively. Well, not like define you positively, but more so just like interact with you positively, right? Like they just see a difference and they see a reason like, oh, this person doesn't understand these things as well. Like I need to talk differently to them. They don't understand all these things. And that just gets really tiring over time because it just keeps happening over and over again, yeah. So, 10 things on a positive note. Some of these things just aren't okay and won't change, and that's okay. All you can do is just be yourself and hope things work out and try and put yourself in a position where your growth will be supported and where you can deviate from some of those trends that you yourself dislike or people would view as harmful. And you just can't keep putting yourself on trial for it and just lampooning yourself over it. You just because that doesn't solve anything, right? It's like you just get stuck in this negative feedback loop where you just keep beating yourself up without understanding why things are the way they are. You know what I mean? Like you just keep putting yourself down while at the same time thinking you're in the right and not realizing like how to change or how to stop doing this thing. The focus just ends up being on the presence of those things and not on fixing them or changing them. And that's all the advice I can really offer you. Yeah. Have a good one.